We went to school in the 60s, and it was the time of the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, and it was an incredibly contentious, divided time, just as it is today. I suppose is what really got me involved in politics. As far as switching from medicine to politics, you can do both in Vermont. I got involved in politics because I was a big fan of Jimmy Carter's and ran and worked in his campaign. The woman who ran his campaign lived down the street from me, Esther Sorrell, who was a state senator at the time. And it was a time of great turmoil in the Democratic Party where a whole bunch of newcomers like me were coming to the state, young professionals escaping the city. And the old time Democrats were all ethnic working class Democrats. It was an interesting mix who were socially more conservative, but we all had sort of the betterment of humankind in common. I was seeing a patient on August 14th, 1991, and I got a phone call from the governor's office, which of course I took, and it was this quavering voice on the other side of the phone that said, "I regret to inform you that Governor Snelling has died and you're the governor." And that was the end of my medical career. What I've done with my life, I've probably done more to improve the lives of human beings in that office than anything else. We had essentially universal health care for everybody under 18. We locked up hundreds of thousands of acres by funneling money into the Housing and Conservation Fund to buy the Long Trail, which was in private hands for the most time, and put a ton of money into the Housing Conservation Fund and expanded conservation. Most known for nationally is something I backed into just because I care about human rights. We were the first state to pass a marriage equality bill. We actually had to call it civil unions because nobody was going to support marriage, but it was functionally marriage, and that set off the whole movement that showed the movement could have some success in treating gay citizens the way we treat everybody else, which is the reason I came to that position. That was not on my agenda. So those are the really big things, because I think the political process has been grossly discredited by the goings on in the last few years, especially when you have somebody like Trump. Trump is a known corrupt person. So in order to vote for Trump, you have to accept his corruptness. There's something fundamentally wrong with you if you are willing to achieve your ends by embracing corruption. And so I don't think the younger generation wants to do that. And the problem with that is the Democrats have been grossly ineffective. And so they don't like either party. So my Amanda Littman's argument is, well, then do something about it and run for office. You can contribute something positive without teaching people to hate the opposition. We've had bad times like this before, is the willingness of supposed political leaders to exploit anger and hate as a way of maintaining power. And the only way to overcome that is to get together as neighbors and talk things through. Which is happening less and less. And the internet, interestingly, I thought the internet was going to solve all the human problems. And of course, it made them all worse because it just simply reflects who we are. But it really reflects the worst in us, not the best in us. I think the most special thing is the town meeting, because it requires everybody. It's almost like the talking stick analogy that you talked about. You don't have to come, but in most towns, you don't get any say if you don't. People hash out issues and fight, and then they have a big potluck supper or dinner afterward, or breakfast or lunch or whatever afterwards. And they can be contentious, but everybody's in the same room. And 3 weeks earlier, you may be fighting with somebody about whether to buy a new grader or not, and whether you want to raise your taxes to do it. But you've probably pulled their son out of the ditch when they just got their car stuck in the snow, or they pulled your wife out of the ditch when she got her car stuck in the snow, and we all have to work together. And that kind of community has been lost in a lot of places, and it isn't lost here. And that makes a big, big difference. All the goodwill in the world and the practicality. I mean, most people in small towns in Vermont are not racists and bigots, but they can be capable of racism and bigotry because they don't know, they haven't met different kinds of people and so forth and so on. So the key is going to be communications and meeting people where they're at. You have to have a mechanism to do that. The mechanisms here are better than they are in most places because there are a lot of small towns in the state. And even in the big towns, you've got discussion forums that are pretty good. For example, Vermont Public Radio is one of the best public radios in the country. Why? Because it has local programs and they discuss hard issues and interview people about them, both conservatives as liberals and so forth and so on. So we've kind of put each other in our neighbor's shoes. And that's what you have to do. If you don't do that, then you get this polarization by people who mean us harm for their own benefit. And that's what's hurting the country right now. I don't know what the future of the country is, but one of the potential futures, if this keeps going, is that we'll just become more like the European Union. We'll have open borders for trade, and then we'll do as we please in each state. You know, this is a corrupt country, and I think people don't realize the degree of the corruption in the United States. One reason is because we've legalized corruption. I mean, if you look at all the court decisions, the court itself is corrupt. I mean, look how the majority got there by funding from the Federalist Society, which is a funnel for gazillionaires to give lots and lots of money to get conservatives on the bench. And that's been going on for a long time. 30% of Americans under 40 think the court is a legitimate body. That is a disaster for law and order and for the rule of law. And we depend on the rule of law here. So we are I think, because of the expropriation of the national governance and the government, we are all on our own here state-wise, and we're going to have to make our own way because we're not going to get any help from the federal government. They're a mess. We got to get these young people, these millennials and the Gen Z people into politics as fast as possible. I actually voted for Pete Buttigieg. I mean, I respect Biden and I like him and all that. But I voted for him just on the grounds that I wanted somebody who was 35 to be the president, because I think we desperately need a new generation. And I think we'll get one, and it'll change things because this generation is idealistic. Freedom and human rights. I mean, there are two reasons that people have come to this country, basically. One is economics. When their lack of freedoms and lack of opportunity is so awful in the other country, they need to feed their families. And so, and that actually gets us the best and the brightest. But most people, especially who come and start from the very, very bottom, come because they have the guts to say, I'm going to start a new life for me and my children and leave my culture behind. That's unbelievably difficult to do. So I would argue that natural selection gives us the best of the best in immigration. I also have come to believe, I've been in probably 90 countries and spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe in a variety of other roles that I have in boards that I'm on. I actually believe that we are now, this world is now one country. I think central government is becoming less and less relevant. The great thing about America, as much as it's suffered in the last few years with, the gross corruption of the kind you don't often see here in the White House, everybody's here. So this is still the great experiment for diversity and whether everybody can get along together. And the honest truth is, between climate change and sort of the natural parts of us as human beings that are not terribly attractive and that are dangerous, if we don't figure out how everybody can work together, then we're not going to be here as a species by the time our grandchildren are adults or our grandchildren's grandchildren. But I do still think America, despite the terrible time that we've had in the past couple of decades and the gross mistakes we've made in foreign policy, which have really made it harder for us to do business in a lot of places, I still think we're the beacon of hope, because we are the place where the most diverse nation on earth. And for all the terrible rhetoric and the racism being used by politicians to divide us right now, it still works. I mean, if you look at what's going on in Texas after the murders in the school system, most of the victims were Latino. And from a Hispanic place, and everybody is all together as sympathetic as they possibly could be, regardless of whatever their ethnic background is. Contrast to that, to the murder of 50 people in a Catholic church in Nigeria in the same week, and you get a country that's much less forgiving of people who aren't like them. One of the things about America that's so very special and that gives us a chance both to fix ourselves and help the world fix itself by example, is this notion that we're all people first. And because we all have to live with each other, whether we like it or not, we're actually beginning to learn how other people are. And the fact is, then we discover that they're much more like us than we ever thought they were. The undercurrent, the real current, is that we are accepting enormous numbers of people from all over the world, some of whom are in the second and third generation, who are contributing enormously to our country. Look at the number of American or Indian Americans who are American citizens who are now running major technological companies. All of a sudden, when you see the boss who doesn't look like you is the boss, suddenly your perspective on what's what begins to change. And suddenly, if you happen to look like the boss, you maybe think that, gee, someday I could do that. I am astonished just looking at, I look at sports. I love especially college sports. I'm astonished, and the evening news. I'm astonished by the number of people of color featured in advertisements with major corporations. That would never used to happen when I was a kid. And that means that everybody who is a member of whatever minority group is on the television in an advertisement for some god-awful product that I don't approve of thinks, wait a minute, that could be me. I'm now part of all this. I think one of the things I always tell kids is your job is to be angry and impatient. And my job is to tell you, if you stick with this, you're going to win. And so the story I always tell about this is when I was at Yale, I had 2 black roommates in my freshman year. It was 1968. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. Martin Luther King was assassinated. The Chicago Convention blew up and somebody was nominated in the back room that had only been to 6 or 8 primaries. And 99 cities were burned down. And I'm not talking about the Black Lives Matter protests where there's some damages. I mean, burned. Washington did not recover for 25 years after the King Association and the assassination. If you could have told us then we were going to have a black president in 40 years, we'd have laughed you right out of the room. And 40 years later, Barack Obama became president. There's no other country in the world that could happen in. This is an interesting point that's happening in this country. Everybody attacks corporations because they're greedy and all this kind of stuff. And I do think that corporate ethics have gone down thanks to Jack Welch and others. But the fact is, corporations are actually pushing a much broader diversity agenda than the government is, even the government of Democrats, although Biden is an exception. There are more Black and Hispanic people in significant positions of authority in this administration than there have ever been in any administration, including Barack Obama's administration. It's an extraordinary thing that he's doing. But for the most part, corporations are leading the way in those ad decisions that they make. Black purchasing power has risen substantially. So now if you don't do that, you pay a price for it if you're a big corporation. So there's a lot of talk, which I think is justifiable, that there's too much of a gap between the top and the bottom and all that. And I think it's true. But I also think that corporations in many cases are far more socially responsible than the government has been, or at least socially effective in making change. I think a little reduction of cognitive dissonance is here. If you think that women shouldn't be engineers, guess what? You're not going to work for Google anymore because it's bad for Google's business to be like that. And so maybe you better rethink your views a little bit. And the reduction of cognitive dissonance is a great function to make that happen. When there's a penalty for being a bigot, you may scream and yell and demand to be a bigot, but you're also going to care about your job and your family, and you may find a way to be less of a bigot. But the fact of the matter is, we can't just look at traditional doctrinaire leftish solutions to everything, because there are solutions elsewhere in the political spectrum, and we need to look at those carefully. And let's listen to conservatives, not to the racism and the bigotry and the stuff that's designed to get votes from the worst instincts in people, but to the solid ideas that make sense.